Take 5. 5 questions to authors and artists. With a common question, we get a personal perspective on what shapes their views. Welcome to Audiobook Radio and our strand, Take 5. So Jeremy Marre, filmmaker and writer. Could you tell me if there was a book that inspired you to write?
I don't think there was any one book that inspired me to write. I think I read quite widely when I was still at school, and particularly when I was at film school and at college. I was very aware that my parents and my grandparents were Russian, and so I started to delve into areas of Russian literature. Not necessarily, the heavyweight Dostoevsky and Tolstoy books, but I remember reading Gorky's books on his childhood. I remember short stories by different writers, Turgenev, and then I'd pick up on books like, I was reading Camus, I think, for school, The Fall, and then he'd make a reference in his introduction to Lermontov, a hero of our time, about a very dark, heroic character. And so I'd follow various trails, various leads. And so to some extent I was fascinated by Russian literature, but I also spread much more widely and was attracted to, I think, just books that gave me a different perspective on life from the one that I was growing up with, rather than a kind of deeper perspective of my own society. So I was reading books by Knut Hamsun, like Hunger. I was looking at American literature and spreading myself quite wide in terms of an experience of different styles and different eras in literature. Really interested in 50s and 60s American literature and black literature. So someone like Ralph Ellison, whose book Invisible Man was
Is that
really
the one that was
inspiring.
made into a movie, Invisible
No.
Man? Oh, okay, I'm thinking.
It was really inspiring. It's about a black kid who makes his way to New York and becomes a messiah. But just the style of writing, which was quite free and quite surreal and very different from the other stuff that I was reading.
Sounds like you were a voracious reader, but I'm just wondering.
I was quite selective, but I didn't read very much mainstream literature. So I'd be reading things like Knut Hamsun's Hunger and all kinds of obscure stuff, and thinking, I'd just be looking at elements of what they'd written and thinking, well, that's really inspirational. But I don't think in any of them did I sit down and say, well, I've got to write like this, or this inspires me to write a book. I just found them inspiring, and if I wrote, which I did, I wrote lots of short stories, and then I was writing scripts, and I was trying to get projects off the ground. I wrote really because I felt that I wanted to say something, sometimes maybe in the style, at that age, in the style of someone else, but not directly because I'd read someone's book.
Mm-hmm. And were you the kind of reader where when you discovered an author, you kind of almost went through all their other books, or did you just find that you just tripped from one idea and sort of subject to another?
Yeah, I mean, if I found a Graham Greene book, like The Lawless Roads, because I was interested in Mexico, because I also had relatives in Mexico, and I'd go there. Then I'd follow through and I'd read his other stuff, the African books and whatever, the ones based in the Caribbean. I was reading a lot of, I suppose unconsciously, I was kind of exploring the world through the books I was reading and thinking, I want to go there and I want to do that, rather than I want to write a book like this. And when I was younger than that, I remember when I was a teenager, I was always reading books about people exploring and people mountain climbing and people going to Africa. And so, yeah, the literature I was interested in was kind of opening places and ideas, rather than books that went deep into my own culture, the culture that I was growing up in. And I didn't really find inspiration in books like Dickens, where I found the style too verbose and too, I don't know, just not stimulating enough. So I was looking much more at the literature of the New World and to some extent Africa as well.
And I don't know if this is going to be applicable, but is there a book that you kind of wished you'd written? Because it sounds very much like they're sort of more visceral and they're more about the, you know, the adventure. It's almost like you wanted to be that person doing whatever it was, whether it was, you know, this incredible voyage or, you know, expedition. But is there a book which something about, whether it be the style or, you know, it just touched so much into your own life that you kind of feel like, oh, that's my story, or I wish that was my story, or I wish I could have written that?
No, I don't think anything like that, really. I'd grown up as a child reading comics and identifying with people in comics, usually the evil characters. And it was interesting, even at that time, I remember reading comic books that something like Dandy and Beano were unacceptable in school, whereas I think it was called The Lion and the something else were acceptable. There was almost a class structure in what you were reading, but the ones that about the wicked people who were doing wicked things were obviously always much more interesting, and that kind of led you on to the kinds of characters also in literature that you were interested in. So it was Lermontov's book, A Hero of Our Time, that the Russian novel, that reading Camus had led me onto. And so those kinds of darker, edgier characters were much more to my liking. Anti-heroes, I suppose, rather than heroes. Although I loved the explorers and the people who achieved, but there was always a kind of darkness to them, or they were going to dark places, either literally or they were, going to the heart of darkness in Africa. So I think I was attracted to some extent, the more shadowy characters.
Yeah, they are always more interesting, more juicy. And do you think there's anything that doesn't belong between the covers of a book?
No, I can't think of anything. Boring books don't belong between the covers of a book. It's funny, but very often, you find a writer and you think, well, I've found someone who I can really identify with. And then, oddly enough, it's only one or two books, and maybe their first book, as in the case of Ralph Ellison, that you can actually say, oh, I've discovered something, and then you become less and less interested. So I think the only thing that shouldn't be between the covers of a book is something that is unstimulating and uninteresting. I don't think you can censor any subject from literature.
Yes. How many books would be published if the criteria was to be stimulating? Doesn't always work, does it?
No, I suppose especially today. I mean, I was at some Guardian book thing, and they were handing around a piece of literature. This is really strange for the Guardian. A piece of literature that I've forgotten her name. Maybe I shouldn't mention it. Mumby, her name was, and she's a kind of chick lit novelist, and she said she had to pay the mortgage, so she'd gone from chick lit to erotic. And the problem with the books were, they were just so badly written. It was almost unbelievable. It was almost like a pastiche of someone trying to write, a piece of chick lit. And I thought that was strange at The Guardian. They were kind of illustrating to people the kind of books that publishers now want. And certainly, they would perfectly fall into the category of something that shouldn't be between the covers of a book.
Oh dear, that is very depressing.
But not because of any erotic content, simply because they're so poorly written.
But erotic is really difficult to do well. It's kind of, an area which is even more subjective than anything else, and somehow seeing it in print always or often feels so cheesy. And
yeah, I think people try to be too literal about it, and I think the suggestive can be more erotic than the
totally literal. Yeah, I agree with that,
especially if the printed page. It's different if maybe if it's a movie, but in terms of the printed page, I think it needs some finessing.
Yeah, I'd go with that. So is there kind of a book that you would want read to you? Like, do you actually listen to audiobooks?
Well, I don't much listen to audiobooks. I sometimes listen to them if I've got a long drive. When I'm filming something in the States and you're driving for 2 days, or if I'm driving through Europe. But then I tend to choose things which are quite light and don't require too much concentration, because I'm not very good at concentrating on an audiobook and driving, because I'm kind of interested in what I'm seeing and I'm looking at things and then I'm missing parts of the story. Also, when I read a book, I like to enjoy other elements than just the storyline. So I'm interested in style and I'm interested in how it was written, and I can't do all that when I'm driving a car, and I don't tend to listen to audiobooks otherwise. So I would go for, not that I'm belittling it at all, a Raymond Chandler, something that kind of hits you between the eyes and which you're sort of familiar with, and where the style's quite racy and you don't have to do too much hard work for it, rather than a piece of literature which I would find, I couldn't listen to Garcia Marquez or something like that while I'm driving. So not really very much. I don't listen to them in the evening. I'd probably fall asleep if I listen to an audiobook. But on the other hand, I'd like also many lighter books. I worked on a series of films with the writer Gerald Durrell, who was the brother of Lawrence Durrell. My brother used to wander around with Lawrence Durrell books, Bitter Lemons and Justine and things like that, which were really heavy literature, really heavy going. And then I met Gerald, and I did a series with him called Ourselves and Other Animals, and I got to read his books, and I had read one or two of them, like My Family and Other Animals, when I was younger, and they're really delightful, and you can read all his books just at a sitting, wherever you are. It doesn't need immense concentration, but I love his humour and I love his insights into the animal world, and it was a fantastic privilege then to get to work with him on 13 films. And I loved his manner as when you're working with him is so similar to that of the writer of the book. I mean, I'm sure that sometimes, I know that sometimes the person is very different from the writer, but in his case, outrageous and funny and difficult and insightful. So that was a delightful time, and I got to read all his books.
Yeah, it sounds it. Have you ever read anything where you almost feel like you prompted to read it out loud, even to yourself, because there's something about, whether it's the rhythm or, the words, that you just feel are almost needing to be said, rather than...
that's a question of style, yeah. I think it's sometimes you work two ends of the extreme. If you're reading something that's written almost like a movie in terms of contemporary American literature, then you might want almost to read it out loud, because you're reading the dialogue, and the dialogue's very short and punctuated and punchy. Or something like I was reading the other day, which was Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse, which is for me a bit of a struggle, but it's written quite lyrically and in a kind of avant-garde way for the time, a kind of Joycean way with very long flowing sentences and lots in parentheses. And there, if you read it out loud, it's more satisfying than not, because you get more of the cadence and the flow of the sentences and the way it's written. So on those two extremes, I think sometimes the really wordy and more difficult writers are good to read out loud. And I think Joyce, for example, would be good to read out, rather than running through page after page after. If you actually put it into words, it becomes more real.
Totally. It's funny because I didn't really grow up with books and came to reading quite late, as a sort of late teens rather than as a young kid. And I have just recently heard Dubliners, and it just made some sense. And I'd picked it up 2 or 3 times before, and I think I don't even remember going beyond chapter 1, because I just found it so difficult. And yet listening to it, it's still, sometimes quite difficult, but it is immensely pleasurable, because there is this sort of flow and these kind of characters, and it, like you say, it's a lot more lyrical, and it, for me, made sense. A difficult book that I could never actually have read or experienced. Somehow on audio it worked. We're at the last question, which is, do you think before the days of print you would have been a storyteller?
Well, I'm a storyteller because I make films. I wrote a book which is all stories, called Beats of the Heart, which is the stories behind the making of films, the stories of what happened when you're shooting them, the stories of travelling, of dealing with artists and dealing with bureaucracies, and
I found it riveting, that book.
Quite hostile regimes, like filming in South Africa during apartheid and having to travel at night.
But listen, Jeremy, if there's no print, there's definitely no filmmaking. We're talking about way back when, around the campfire potentially.
This is all storytelling. Several of the films I've made have been films that have included storytelling. For example, I did a film with the Mangbetu cannibals in the Congo.
Sorry, the which cannibals?
Mangbetu, the last tribe of cannibals in the Congo, which was for BBC and the American Natural History Museum. And every evening, I mean, they didn't have any radios or televisions, they were living in the middle of nowhere in the bush. So every evening they'd sit around the fire, and for 3 or 4 hours, people would be telling outrageous stories. I mean, that they'd be translated for us. But and also in Madagascar, there was with a travelling troupe of musicians. Every evening it was storytelling, because storytelling is so much part of the culture and so much part of their lives and their history as well, which is all carried from one generation to another in their stories, either deliberately or it's just part of the fabric of the story. So I've found myself filming stories, and very often, even when making a documentary, you're thinking in terms of stories. How do I make a story out of this? How do I make a story out of the life of someone like Big Bill Broonzy, who had to fight against all kinds of limitations, who had to reinvent himself? What's it like to reinvent yourself as an artist or as a human being when you're forced into a situation, which he was several times, from killing a man or from travelling north or from coming into Europe where he wanted to change his identity. These are people who are great storytellers, not just in their lives but also in their music, and making music is very, very often about telling stories. I mean, working with someone like Paul Simon, I mean, all his best songs are miniature stories. He's a miniature story writer. And very often he writes those lyrics first, and he's got a story which he then puts to music. So in some ways, I think all people who work in the arts are storytellers. And even if they are dealing in a factual area, I think you're dealing in terms of people's fantasy, people's self-invention. And I think that probably one way or another we're all storytellers. So before the printed page and before film, probably, we'd have sat around the fire telling stories in the evening. And it's interesting how embellished those stories are when you're with some of those communities who don't have television, don't have radio, because you can hear the same story on different occasions, and it's a different story with different emphasis and different characters, and they're entertainers. So even though they're carrying the history, of their society, and they're passing on all kinds of different elements of their lives and the lives of the community, they're entertaining and they're amusing, and there's huge feedback as well. So I think, much like performing to an audience today, if you're a comedian or if you're making a film, you're always thinking in terms of your audience. And I think most writers, whatever they say, aren't really writing for themselves, but they have a reader in mind. I think that the storyteller is thinking or is performing for an audience in the same way that we all do when we create contemporary art forms.
I'd agree with that totally. Jeremy Marre, thank you very much.